So I'm chairing the afternoon session, and I needed to say, Judy has asked me to say that we are going to be taking some photos of these images because in the next couple of weeks our project is going to have a website. So if you do not want your work to be on the website, can you please please tell Judy, and we will not put it up. There won't be any names attached to it, so it will be anonymous, but if you don't want that, that's fine. We can do that. I'm very delighted that Caterina Albano is going to be speaking today. She is a reader in visual culture and science here at Central St. Martin's, and she has a long-term research interest in the history and affect of emotion. So she has written a great deal about our emotional life. She's the author of Memory, Forgetting, and the Moving Image from 2016, Fear and Art in the Contemporary World, which is from 2012, and has written many essays and articles on fear and anxiety, the politics of memory, and contemporary art, on anatomy and eating disorders, on curating, and she was also, is a curator, is a curator with really many exceptionally important exhibitions like Anxious Places, Angst, Environments and Affective Contamination, also psychoanalysis, a wonderful exhibition on psychoanalysis, the unconscious of everyday life from the Science Museum, crossing over art, science and biotechnologies at the Royal Institute of Great Britain, and there are many others on her biog. So I'm delighted that she's going to be talking to us about vulnerability, the making of a discourse. So, Caterina.
Thank you, Jo. When Jo and Judy asked me to take part to this symposium, I was delighted. It was very exciting. And I'm very grateful to them for having invited me. But then, and they suggested that I could contextualize the concept of vulnerability. At that point, it also felt like, wow, it's going to be big. How am I going to do it in 15 minutes? So I'm trying to really sort of point to some directions of the way in which vulnerability has become an important critical concept that has been used to challenge positions that have been increasingly difficult within neoliberalist thinking and the constant pressure of the politics of fear. I want to start by looking at the etymology of the word vulnerability. As we already heard this morning, the terms come from a Latin root, entered relatively late in the 17th century, vulnerare and vulnus, so they refer to the wound, to being wounded. There are two facets of this term: to be exposed to the possibility of being attacked and harmed, either physically or emotionally, or of a person in need of special care, support, protection because of age, disability, or risk of abuse or neglect. There is an evident tension between these two meanings of the term. One suggests a body that has to defend itself, and the other one, a body in need to be defended. there is this inherent tension between the position of where vulnerability is situated in relation to the subject. The development in political thinking and ethics around the possibility of vulnerability, of being understood in terms of resistance, is really in relation to this articulation of the terms, and to shift the emphasis from the potential passivity or the paternalistic use of the term vulnerable, in order to try to find possibility of giving this vulnerable subject a position that render it, that give it some form of voice, of agency, or possibility of expression that doesn't reduce it to that. But this shift into a relational and affirmative understanding of vulnerability has taken a quite a long way and quite a long track. Historically, and I'm going to talk about vulnerability in terms of embodiment. And with embodiment, I understand psychosomatic unity is about our physical, corporeal sense, whether it is through pain, of muscular tension, but also of our perceptive capacity, of our ability to emote, in terms of affect, of a body that is affected, but also affect other body that exist in an environment and interact with this environment, and also cognitive level of perception. These two images point to two bodies that are vulnerable and at the same time are resistance. And their resistance is in terms of resisting interpretation. They challenged the medical understanding of their time. The first is an engraving of a case of self-starvation, and the problem with it is that if vulnerability is understood in terms of the body in relation to the norms and the construction of the body which are active in culture at any given time, the vulnerable body challenges the norms. The first case, the challenge that it exceeded it by incorporating it to a point to make the norm a paradox. The other case, hysteria, was that it challenged the positivistic understanding of the relationship between health and disease in terms of physiological symptoms. Hysteria presented symptoms that could not be ascribed to a physiological cause, and that couldn't quite be framed within the medical theories of the time. This resistance of interpretation is yet also the way in which the medical discourse reshapes these bodies. And these images are actually a documentation of the medical reappropriation of this body, of the way in which the resistance that the body presented in terms of an attempt to remake them acceptable, to reframed within a certain construction. And there is also a resistance in terms of the historians, of those who go to the archive and look at this material. These bodies are silent. We don't have anything that actually actually tell us what were the experience of these women. So we are faced with the question, how do we tell their story? What is the stories behind what we can glean from the document that are actually made by those who felt threatened by these bodies? And indeed, one of the issues and one of the problems that the concept of vulnerability presents us with is really about the ways in which vulnerability can be appropriated and can actually shift within the discourses in which it is used. All these bodies were at the same time constructed as vulnerable and as threatening. And indeed, the way in which they were pathologized, criminalized, constructed within a colonial discourse through ethnographic construction of the body testify to the way in which they were marginalized and they were felt as a threat to society. So what happened is that the cultural construction of the body appropriated the vulnerable idea of being, of need to protection to itself, is something that we are still doing. Just think of our policy against immigration. The state and society feel threatened, and therefore the construction of the immigrant has both someone that needs to be protected, but that also constantly needs to defend himself. So there is this sort of paradoxical shaping of it that is still quite active. At the same time, the risk to construct these bodies as eminently vulnerable also position us into a kind of humanitarian discourse that, again, it might create an affective and emotional response. So we need to help, we need to protect, but do we actually give a voice to these bodies? Do we actually listen to their stories and what comes from their own positions? Trauma has obviously a close relation to the idea of vulnerability. Indeed, vulnerability and trauma share the same etymological root. One comes from the Latin, the other one comes from the ancient Greek. And trauma has been really psychoanalytical understanding of trauma, and generally psychoanalysis had been quite critical in helping to articulate the idea of vulnerability. At the same time, with trauma, has also been issues about the construction of the victim and potential victimizations of the vulnerable body. It is, however, with the recognition of trauma as belonging to the everyday, as being part of the everyday experience, as form of distress, of the kind of marginalization, the kind of ways in which we embody certain feeling because of embodied history of discrimination, that actually we begin to generate almost an archive of feelings that becomes a part of the interactive way in which our, as a subject, we both respond affectively, emotionally, cognitively to the world around us and to the way in which this world shapes us. One of the sort of ways, one of the ways in which the issue of vulnerability has begun to point to resistance has a way to challenge the kind of dichotomy within the terms. Has been through a questioning of the ethic of appearance and visibility in relation to space. Indeed, the work of Hannah Arendt and Frantz Fanon has variously influenced the contemporary rethinking of people like Judith Butler, but also Elsa Durling, Sarah Hammett, around the dynamics of the circulation of emotion amongst body and the affective relation that exists among them. The feminism has been critically crucial to these articulations. And Elsa Durling, in a book that traces the history of self-defense, points to the ways in which bodies that had been taught, that had embodied as an emotion in terms of being self-defensive, or something constantly having to be to the lookout for how to minimize the possible violence that would affect them, began to occupy differently the public space, and that the space of appearance of suggested by Hannah Arendt takes a new form. And one of the examples that Durling gives is how the suffragette movement had courses on martial arts, and how martial arts helped women who were then marching the street to occupy the street, to use the body differently. They would be able to defend themselves against the police, but also the muscular way in which they were using the body, how they use inertia to resist, created a different presentation of a body that was thought of being vulnerable and in need to be resistant. It is indeed that we need to think always the resistance in relation to the contingency in which it is presented, as much as vulnerability. So we need to unpick the situation to see how it works, not to trying to impose it as almost as a layer or as a lens of interpretation. And something that is important, I think, in relation to the role of the arts is indeed how we position ourselves in a relation to the vulnerable body that we want to articulate and the kind of resistance that we are looking for. So how do we talk about it? The language that we use. Here is a dance performance that dealt with hearing, and the dancer is actually wearing hearing aids, and he did the whole performance without it. So that was one of the way of, but I want to conclude with this quotation from Han Kang that brings me back to the archive. It is from a fictional work entitled Human Acts. Han Kang was 9 when the repression of students occupied a public building and all the students were massacred happened. She then looked for these stories, and in Human Acts gives voice to the resistance of those bodies. But in the epilogue, where she tells how she came about to write these stories, she points to her own position in relation to what she was doing. I'd been mistaken when I thought of them as victims. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will take the Q&A at the end of the session. So thank you very much for that. Very good mapping, excellent mapping of different ways of thinking about vulnerability and resistance historically and in the contemporary moment. So thank you. You know, many years, and I've never had a chance to properly introduce myself. And I'm always like, that woman, I want to know more about that woman. She's the woman that does all of this great work on psychoanalysis. So thank you so much for agreeing to speak about your work, which I think is fantastic. So Sal has directed, Okay. Films directed by Sal include neuropsychology and psychiatry collaborations on epilepsy, visual agnosia, and psychosis, and they were funded by the Wellcome Trust Award. Her work has been screened internationally, including at the Chicago, Toronto, and Melbourne International Film Festivals, the British Council's Best Short screened at the Cannes International Film Festival, and a nomination for the UIP Prize at the Rotterdam International Film Festival. So I'm, totally delighted that you're here. Should I say a little bit about Beverly? So
yes, please do. Yes, yes. So Beverly, by the way, is here. She's incarnated to be here today.
Okay, so Beverly Carruthers is the course leader for the BA in photography at LCC, is a graduate from the Royal College of Art and a member of LCC's Photography and Contemporary Imaginary Research Hub, hosting exhibitions and conferences and producing publications. Beverly is a photographer and educator who makes work and conducts research around ideas of the primal, and her photographs are a result of exploring this through carefully sourced and sometimes construed situations. So we're really very, very pleased to have you here, Sal, talking about your project. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's lovely to meet you. And it's very exciting. This whole project has been very exciting. I was here at the launch of it. Just to say, I have nothing to do with, I don't know anything about, although I have met psychoanalysts, largely because if you work with neuroscientists, they become horrified at the mere mention of the word. And it's something that I'm sure most people know, but it is quite shocking, this divide that exists between the medical perception of what psychoanalysis is about and what is perceived to be correct medical procedure, etc., etc. So we have these massive divisions. Just to say, Beverly is very sorry not to be here. This is a complete co-production between Beverly and myself. Beverly has beautiful eyes, unlike her effigy here, and a lovely smile that's gone for some reason. Okay, so first of all, with my research, my primary objective is to look at the subjective experience. Who's watching the time, by the way?
I am.
Good, okay, give me lots of warning. So that's what motivates me. That's what I'm interested in as a filmmaker, is what are people feeling? And we are in an academic institution where it's all about the thought process. And much of this morning I was dying, particularly with the opening, where we're looking at this concept of producing artwork through the influence of a different stylist. What does it feel like for John to create through the language of a different artist's style? And I think that's really interesting, and I'll come back to that. So I'm going to start with an overview, which is that Beverly and I are running a series of workshops. We are right in the middle of it. So, and Judy and Joe know this, it's undigested, and there's, we're actually not even finished the workshops, let alone started the research and the evaluative processes. So it's really in process. I'm going to look also at and scrutinize a little bit the process of what we're doing as researchers when we engage with this kind of subject. I'd like to thank very much Clare. I think this comes naturally and meaningfully after, where are you? Yeah, very responsively to what you're talking about. So, the genesis of this project, which is to run a series of workshops for people struggling with stress and anxiety and mental health problems, are students with these issues. So we're developing a series of workshops that we're researching in order to find a way of having a program within initially LCC, but ideally the whole university, that is part of the program in the way that you identify that's something that needs to be systemically addressed in a way that has a profound and meaningful impact on our students. Well, of course, this comes out of, incentive comes out of reality. How many students are in the audience? Hands proudly out. Okay, so why are we here? Why do we exist? Because of the students. That's what matters. That's what's important here. And if of course, you will be experiencing lots of things. What we as staff see is a massive increase of mental health presentations, issues. I think Sarah Campbell, not the Sarah Campbell in the room, but the other Sarah Campbell, who's involved with student services, said that UAL is one of the top 2 universities with the highest percentage of students going to student services in the country. So, and of course we're an arts institution where the whole idea is that you are experimenting with who it is to be, who you are and exist, and so there's the very fact of what we do puts us right on the forefront, on the edge. This is quite natural. But we have to confront and deal with something as vital as this, in the same way that we absolutely have to embody the issues around race. We have a profound need to do that. So just very briefly, I will be a bit more precise on the project itself. We got, first of all, Beverly and I have run this kind of workshop. Both of us have run hundreds of workshops in terms of what we do. Teaching film in my case, teaching photography in Beverly's case. I set up an organization called Inner Vision, which is a group of graduates, largely LCC, but graduates from UAL who have mental health conditions. They are successful artists, first and foremostly. They've shown at the Tate or, all over the place. They are they manage their condition, they manage their lives, and they have been successful. So it's a marvelous group that Jill and I have been involved in now for a few years. We ran an extraordinary workshop with them. I've run workshops with people with epilepsy in terms of my filmmaking. Beverly ran a workshop, I think about 2 terms ago, that I attended on discussing and workshopping aspects of mental health. And she brought in two members of our Inner Vision group who were also graduates from photography at LCC. And they talked about their work, they presented their work, and then there was a photographic program workshop. So we took this idea and we went to Teaching and Learning Fund, Innovation Fund. We got some money, and we are now in the middle of what we're calling creative transformation. It's a workshop. There are 3 of them, and they'll be evaluated. We have external collaborators, one from Oxford University who's an anthropologist, the other is a neuroscientist from King's, but she's also very involved in teaching, and they've also run programs and researched these kind of programs. So we had to cancel the first one because of not yet getting it through ethical approval. The second one didn't quite make it. So we have run one that can be part of the research data analysis, and we've got one more to do. So essentially, how am I doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll try and be brief. So essentially, that's the setup. I did want to briefly discuss a couple of things that I think are really important. One is coming up in the workshop themselves. We're looking at performance and photography and film in relation to a creative transformation. That's to say, to try and have some exercises where the individuals go through some kind of transformation. But in relation to thinking about vulnerability and resilience, I think given that these are very complex, multi-staged processes, I wanted to make an analogy between vulnerability as an early stage process of creativity itself. I think that Anne-Marie mentioned the word surrender, which is likewise one of the many, many processes you can, if you're lucky, go through in this. In surrendering, you open yourself out to other or the other, allowing for a transformation. And I've always seen creativity as something that comes out of free fall. If you let go of the coordinates that you hold on to in life, that we are given, that are reaffirmed constantly, the moment you let go of them and you're in free fall, there is the potential to grab out at something new, to create afresh your coordinates, your framework, whatever Cartesian system you can invent. So that being vulnerable, being open to feeling, surrendering and allowing is so fundamental and makes such a perfect analogy of what we're all here for in terms of our own work, which is being creative. And I think this is something that we really need to consider. I'm going to jump away from that because I'm probably only got about 2 minutes, because I mentioned scrutinizing research. And I think this is absolutely essential. We have not really talked about feelings at all we've talked about experience profoundly and meaningfully. But when we do research, we intellectualize and we strip out and we reconfigure in a safe way what we think. We present in a certain way. And this can be very damaging. And we're talking about mental health here. There are and the reason we do research is so that we can publish and we can justify our existences here as staff. But I think there's a real danger in that, because what we have here are real people that are really suffering. In the past few months, I have been to probably about 10 of these kind of brilliant and wonderful and meaningful events. What I'm not seeing is something where action really happens as a result. And the problem, as I see it, is that we're not coordinating, we're not connecting. We're not looking at how we can use the research we're doing to actually have agency and say, what are we doing for these students that mean that we are proactive in helping them be the creative people and intelligent people that they have potential for. So if we do anything today, I think it's absolutely essential that we gather together everybody who's doing work in anything related to mental health, and we work out a map of who's doing what, where, what the research is going towards, and how we can coordinate that in such a way that it doesn't just become a publication that sits on a shelf somewhere and does our CVs good, maybe, if we're lucky. It's not why I'm here. And thank you. So a part of that, part of the fact we need to coordinate and talk to each other and actually be methodical about it and connect, is also to look at the processes within this university. And every single university has to deal with the most important thing, which is morality around here. We call it going through a process of ethical approval. We need to look at how that is run so that we are guided before we look for funding, so that we don't spend years going for funding where the research is never going to happen because it cannot get through ethical approval because we haven't understood how the processes work. I have been through this with every film I've made. Every film I've made. And mostly I go through an ethical approval system through another university with a neuroscientist because they have a medical department and you understand how it works. Or I'm working with somebody who understands the system. But we need to look at all the systems that we have in place to make sure that when we do research, it has a purpose and it has an ability to affect people's lives. And in this case, we're talking about students. We're talking about here, people in the room that we care about. Thank you.
Now I know why in those meetings I kept saying, I need to meet her. I need to talk to her. Thank you, Sal. Okay, the final speaker for this session is Susan. There she is, coming down. And let me just read her biography. So Susan Ibreck is the education manager at INNOVA, which is the Institute of International Visual Art. And it's just been rehoused at Chelsea College of Art. Yeah. So we're very, very, very pleased that you are here. Susan is responsible for developing the role that the learning cards play, which is what she's going to be talking about, in INNOVA's educational offer for schools, community groups, art therapists, and the general public. Susan has worked in the arts education sector for 15 years. With a background in fine art, she also currently works as a producer on local community arts projects. So thank you very, very much for coming in and talking to us about INNOVA a little bit as well as your project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's been really amazing to be part of today. So INNOVA is the Institute of International Visual Arts, and as Joanne says, we have just relocated from Shoreditch to being based on the Chelsea College of Art campus, and our library, the Stuart Hall Library, just opened 3 weeks ago, so please come and visit because it is amazing. It's a really beautiful space, and we have an amazing visual arts collection, but also a lot of texts on social, cultural studies, post-colonialism. So yeah, I hope to see you all there. So INNOVA was set up 25 years ago this year to predominantly to sort of give more voice and focus to British artists of African, Asian and Caribbean heritage who were sort of not represented in the mainstream, and that work continues today. INNOVA Creative Learning is a partnership between INNOVA and A-Space, which is an arts and therapy service, who work in a lot of schools in Hackney. So they first got together to collaborate on a series of resources initially meant to be used for their art therapists. So these are called emotional learning cards, and that is sort of a core part of what I do, what my job is sort of based around. This one shows the first set of cards to be produced. The cards present carefully curated images by international artists on one side, combined with therapeutic prompts and text on the reverse. The sets are themed, and the images, prompts, and texts are there to support the exploration of that theme. The idea behind them was to broaden and increase the quality of the resources that therapists were using with their clients, raise the bar in the types of images that were being used, and because they were created by diverse artists, a whole new range of conversations could be opened up. And especially from work in primary schools and secondary schools, you're then able to show images that kids can relate to, you know, because obviously we've got such a range of children in our schools, and they can see something of maybe their mothers or their grandparents' heritage reflected in the artists that are creating these works, or in the works themselves. And also it presents opportunities for more challenging conversations for people who have not, you know, had sort of similar sort of cultural experiences. So this is an image by Hugh Locke, and you can see some of the text on the side, which is actually in the main written by Lynn French, who's the director of A-Space, psychotherapist and psychoanalyst. So what is emotional learning? I'm sorry if this is patronizing or anything, but it's the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So quite a constructive and useful thing, really. So far there have been 7 sets created. Titles that you can see there, the A to Z of emotions, what do you feel, etc. And the most recent set of cards, the A to Z of relationships and the values cards, were produced in partnership with the Schools Federation, who were looking for additional resources to support in the training of senior leadership and teach British values, help their teachers teach British values, a subject they were struggling with for hopefully quite obvious reasons. But so that one, the values cards, was actually completely illustrated by the artist Shiraz Beju, whereas the other cards were either a complete mix of artists or a small group of specially commissioned artists. So both INNOVA and A-Space realised the potential of the cards to do more than just be used in a one-to-one or small group basis. The success of them was realised in being able to support in different areas, such as language, visual literacy, so language in terms of vocabulary, and alongside the supporting the exploration of art and art making, it also supported critical thinking skills as well. So with the cards, we deliver Art Lab, which is an artist and art therapist-led program of workshops in schools. We deliver CPD for teachers and art therapists, and workshops for community groups and the wider public. And we provide free resources as well to support the use of the cards. So one of the core exercises that we use with the cards, often to kick off workshops, is free association. And I actually didn't know that it was called free association. What we were doing was called free association until really recently. But apparently it's a recognized and fundamental rule of psychoanalysis. And essentially we put words and phrases on a table. We give the participants a card, one of the emotional learning cards each. We sort of tell them not to look at the prompts on the back, but just look at the image themselves. And either using the text prompts, sort of think about what that image is saying to them, you know, or if the prompts aren't helping them, just write your own thing. And I kind of wanted to do that now, if that's okay, a bit of audience participation. But yeah, so if you have a look at this card, see what it's saying to you, see what you think it's about. Yeah, just whether it sparks a train of thought, where it goes. And I'll give you sort of 20 seconds or so to look at them, and here are some of our prompts, if those help you. Okay, does anybody want to share? Does anybody want to share what they were thinking about? It's fine if you don't. One of the, I do this talk and workshops with a colleague from A-Space called Jo, who's a fantastic art therapist, and she always tells the story of using this card. So she had a client, a little girl who was, had recently moved to the country. She was struggling in school, and Jo wasn't able to connect with this child. So in one of the sessions, she'd put out an array of the emotional learning cards, and the child picked this one. And they were able to then have a conversation about the fact that this reminded the child of her mum and shopping with her mum, and that's the last time she'd seen her mum. So that then obviously opened up a whole new space for Jo to sort of build and connect on. One thing I did want to just say, actually, is what we also do is a lot of collage-based stuff, and so free association with imagery and colour and shape. So we get our participants to do that, and it's really nice and really interesting to do that with teachers, particularly, because a lot of the feedback we've had is that it's then put them in a situation of feeling vulnerable in terms of feeling stressed about making something, if they're not creative at all, or even if they are, the pressure on them to create something good, alongside sort of realizing what it's like when they're asking their kids to do something, their kids in the classroom to do something that those kids aren't comfortable with doing. So I think that's a really important thing, and I actually find it really difficult when I'm doing it as well. So it's kind of, yeah, it kind of opens up your vulnerability in lots of ways. This is an art lab that we've just completed at a primary school in Tottenham. It's year one of a 3-year funded project by Children in Need, and it's working with kids with social, emotional and behavioural issues. We had an exhibition of the work, and this is Shepherd Manuka, who actually teaches here as well. He's a fantastic artist, and he co-led the project alongside an art therapist. The project did have a massive impact on the children involved. We had a launch for the exhibition, and our grants officer came and she cried, and it was awesome because she was so overwhelmed by the kids' sort of engagement and reaction to the workshops, which is fantastic. One of the key things feedback-wise from the teachers was that following the workshops, the children were clearly more able to discuss how they were feeling rather than lashing out or retreating into themselves. They could name emotions, which meant that the teacher was able to better support them and resolve problems, which is a really sort of fantastic step forward in terms of building children's confidence in being able to talk about what they're feeling. So this way of working has also had a really big impact on the artist involved, and because he's learning to, or in this case Shepherd, but they're learning to work in different ways alongside an art therapist and taking time out to sort of question what the art making is doing in terms of how it's making people feel. And putting those sort of exercises into the sessions meant that Shepherd was doing that to himself as well. And I think what we kind of need to do now is look at better supporting the artist in that sort of journey. I think, yeah, this is just one of the kids doing a free association, but I think what we're thinking about is the fact that artists are often put in positions where they're having to deal with quite stressful situations, or emotionally challenging situations, and whereas you put an art therapist in that situation, they would get supervision, they'd get support, whereas the artist's not getting support. So we kind of want to look at that next and how we better support them. So for us, the ideal is for cards to be used more widely in all schools, colleges, universities, and health settings. And what we'd ideally like is to embed emotional learning in the curriculum using the cards. But from primary to higher education, from the benefit of teachers and students alike. So a lot of the conversations I'm having, and it's really timely coming after Sal's talk as well, is about how teachers and lecturers are having to take on more pastoral care of their students, which they don't feel able to do, time pressures and emotional pressures. So we're thinking as well about how we can embed this kind of emotional learning or this emotional support throughout the curriculum, so that it's not something that students go to external from what they're doing, but it's built internally into the courses that they're on. Yeah, and that's it. That's a nice picture that one of the kids did. And that's it.